22 of Project E55 ASL, and I'm actually filming the intro midway through the video this time. That's why you guys can see some carbon fiber work going on in the background. But anyways, this video is going to be about taking this car to the dyno, getting everything tuned up, and seeing how much power this engine actually makes. Quite a lot of you guys actually requested me to make a video on tuning, so in this video I'm going to try to cover everything in as much detail as possible about how to get this engine working with a standalone ECU, and then how to tune it and get the proper power numbers out of it. So it should be quite a long and interesting video. Let's, well, I was about to say let's take this car to the dyno, but I've already taken it to the dyno, so let's get to showing you guys what happened at the dyno. So just starting off by going over the hardware side of things to show you guys everything that I'm using to actually run the engine. So I'm actually using a standalone ECU. It's an Infinity 508, and I covered the install for this ECU in part 16 of the video series. So that one was all about the hardware side of things, like wiring everything on the engine to the ECU. This video is mostly going to be about the software side of things, what to do with your laptop to actually program this thing to actually control the engine properly. But actually, just to give you guys a bit of good news, VRP might actually be coming up with a wiring harness adapter that, with that, you guys will basically be able to plug in your E55 wiring harness directly into this ECU without making any modifications to the wiring harness. So yeah, that's the ECU, and this is the engine that it's controlling. So most of you might already know about this engine if you watched previous videos. This is an E55 engine. It's a 5.4 liter AMG V8. From the factory it comes with a supercharger, but I'm actually using it with twin turbos, and there's a few changes that I've made to the internals of the engine as well. From the factory it comes with a 9:1 compression ratio, but I'm actually running an 8.5:1 compression, so slightly lower. And I've also ported the intake and exhaust manifolds so they flow a little better. Sorry, not the manifolds, the heads, but I've also gone with custom manifolds too to actually match the size of those ports. But other than that, the engine is on stock internals. There's no other modifications internally done to the engine. It's not on stronger internals or anything. And yeah, that's all the hardware. Now let's get to the software side of things and how to actually set up the ECU and how to control all of this. Okay, so now I'm in the car, I have my laptop plugged in, and this is a software that you'll need to program in Infinity. For every different ECU there's a different software for that, but anyways, what I want to go through is that I'll start off by showing you guys everything you need to do to actually get the engine started with this ECU, and then later get into the fun stuff of what are some of the values I'm looking for when I'm actually running the car on the dyno, and actually showing you guys the dyno runs and how they look like, how these tables actually look like when the car is actually going through the full engine load range and everything. But anyways, yeah, starting off with the basics, how to actually set up the ECU and how to get the engine started. So on the AEM Infinity, you'll need to go to Wizards and basically open up this tab. And on this tab, well, first off, let's start off with the engine. So you'll need to tell the ECU what engine it is, the displacement of the engine, the number of cylinders, 4-stroke obviously. So once you have everything set up over here, next you will go to the cam and crank. You will need to tell the ECU what type of cam position sensor and what type of crank position sensor you have. So you actually need to go here and select, I believe for this engine it's one of these. It's 60 teeth in total with 2 missing teeth, and it's a Mac type sensor. And yeah, the cam position sensor is one Hall cam. So I think it's this one. This is the one that I'm using right now. I don't want to change anything right now because I have everything already set up and it's working properly. But anyways, after that it's yeah, the injector setup. You basically need to tell the ECU when to fire the injectors. This is actually based on your fire pattern. You will need to search up the fire pattern of your engine and yeah, go according to that. And after that you will get to the basic sensor setup. So you'll need to set up some of your sensors, like the air temperature sensor, the coolant temperature sensor, map sensor. So basically all these sensors need to be calibrated in the ECU. So let's just open one of these sensors and show you guys. So basically, like, some sensors will have an ohm reading that will change. So temperature sensors usually have an ohm, a resistance value that changes as the temperature changes. So basically the way I set up these sensors is that I just used hot water for all the temperature sensors. Just dip them in hot water and use a thermometer, and then you can actually see if the corresponding value actually gives you the right temperature or not. For some of these sensors, you actually might even already be able to find a sensor that's already in the database for the Infinity. That way you just need to select the right sensor, and it's already done for you. For other sensors that are not in the database, those sensors you will need to calibrate yourself. For the manifold pressure sensor, I just used a bicycle pump and a pressure thing just to see what type of pressure I was actually putting into the manifold pressure sensor, and then seeing what type of voltage I get, and then yeah, basically setting up this table. It's not that difficult, it's just a little time consuming to set up everything. And then the other really important thing is the ignition sync. So before you can start your engine, you will actually need to tell the ECU where zero timing is. So basically you set this timing, lock timing at 0 degrees, and then you'll need to use a strobe gun and actually crank your engine and see if you're actually getting 0 degrees at that point or not. If you're not getting 0 degrees, then there's a trigger offset that you can offset from here and take it to a point where the strobe gun always flashes when your crankshaft is at 0 degrees. And other than that, yeah, this will mainly depend on your needs, like how much you're running, like if you're running nitros or not, if you want to program two-step or not. So all those things really, all those things are over here. But yeah, other than that, this is generally the stuff you need to set up. And after that, you will be able to go over here and start your engine up. Actually, there's also this start thing over here that you might need to set up, like the VE table for cranking. So actually, now that we are on the topic of VE tables, let me just start off by explaining to you guys what engine maps are and like why they look like this and why you need to change them to change certain things on your engine. So yeah, just starting off with this map, this is the VE table of this engine that it's running on. The VE stands for volumetric efficiency, and it's basically a fuel table. It's using these values to calculate how much fuel it needs to put into the engine. So basically what this axis over here is, it's the manifold pressure sensor. It's telling it what the pressure is inside the intake manifold, and this axis is the RPM. So as, let's just say that you're at, there's zero pressure inside the intake manifold, that means you're at atmospheric pressure. So you're pretty much like, in a naturally aspirated car, that would mean you're at full throttle. And let's say you're at 1000 RPM. So you're basically telling the ECU that when it's under those conditions, it's going to use the value from this cell to know what the volumetric efficiency of the engine is at that point. And using this volumetric efficiency number will calculate how much fuel it has to send into the engine at that given point. So let me actually start up the engine and show you guys, well, when I rev the engine, what type of values you'll see on this table. So I'm just going to start the engine up for a bit because my garage is closed right now. I don't want to start it up for too long. Let's see if the ECU is connected. Okay, so the ECU is connected. Let me fire the engine. Okay, so now the engine is on and running, and there's, I'm not sure if you can see it too well, but there's like these few cells over here that are highlighted. That means that the ECU right now is picking the value from this cell over here, so it's picking 81. You can actually see the VE value that it's picking over here. It's 81. So that means that the engine, the map is right now at -12, and the RPM of the engine is at 750. So now if I slowly rev the engine, you will actually see this value going up along this range. Right now, since the engine is under no load at all, I wouldn't be able to take the map value up any higher. Like, it will always stay in this line over here. But that's really where the dyno comes in. When you're at the dyno, you can actually put the engine under actual load, and you can actually change it, like, and you can actually take it to different load levels and basically go through this full map. Right now I can rev it and show you guys what happens if it goes to a slightly higher load level, but you can see that it's not going to be possible to like take it to these load levels at least. So yeah, that's really where the dyno comes in. Actually, before I go any further with the video, I just want to take some time to explain what volumetric efficiency is and why it's actually so important and why it's actually such a critical part of determining the power output of your engine. So I'm just going to use this crappy engine animation that I made earlier to explain all this. What volumetric efficiency is well, the displacement of your engine is how much this piston displaces air when it's at top dead center and when it goes all the way down to bottom dead center. But what volumetric efficiency is how much air this engine can suck in one given cycle of the engine compared to its displacement. So let's say the displacement is 5 liters, but when the piston actually moves from top dead center to bottom dead center on this given cycle of the engine, it only draws 4 liter from the intake manifold. So then you'll basically do the maths, and whatever the percentage of that value will be, that will be the volumetric efficiency at that load level. Now, the reason why volumetric efficiency changes with RPM and even with load is that, let's say like the engine is spinning at a really fast RPM, just to tell you guys one variable. So now at such a high RPM, the piston is going to be moving down so quickly that there's going to be a massive bit of restriction in the intake manifold. Like, the piston is moving down so fast, it's trying to suck in all the air, but there's just not enough time for the air to come in because the RPM is so high. So what's going to happen is that obviously the volumetric efficiency that the engine sees at a lower RPM, it's not going to be able to reach the same volumetric efficiency at a higher RPM. But according to that example, you might say, wouldn't an engine have its maximum volumetric efficiency at like 0 RPM, and then as the RPM goes up, the volumetric efficiency decreases like almost linearly? But because of the way valve timing works, that's not really the case, because just to show you guys an example, you might notice even in this example that when the piston reaches top dead center and when it starts moving down, the intake valve actually starts opening slightly before top dead center. So the piston it has not even reached top dead center and the intake valve actually starts opening over here already. Same with the exhaust valve, it actually closes after the piston reaches top dead center. So basically there's a bit of an overlap between these two valves where the intake valve and the exhaust valve are going to be open at the same time. And that might seem extremely stupid, why anyone would do that, why you would leave both the valves open at the same time. But the reason behind that is that when you think of the engine moving at a really fast RPM, like let's say 4000 RPM, there's going to be a bit of exhaust scavenging that is going to be going on. So there's going to be a bit of flow that is going to form in the exhaust manifold, because of which the exhaust will try to keep rushing out of the exhaust manifold and the intake will try to keep rushing in from the intake manifold. So by leaving a bit of an overlap and by overlapping these valves at the right point, you can actually cause this effect where the intake will keep coming into the combustion chamber and the exhaust will keep going out, and you will actually get a better volumetric efficiency by leaving a small amount of valve overlap at a certain RPM, of course, whichever RPM the cams are tuned for. The same thing is going to happen when the piston moves all the way down to bottom dead center, and when it starts moving back up, you might notice that the intake valve is not going to exactly close when the piston is at bottom dead center. It's going to wait for the piston to come back up and then the intake valve is going to close. That again might seem extremely stupid, why anyone would do that. Why not close the valve like right when the piston is at bottom dead center? But again, when you think about the engine revving at a really high RPM, like let's say 4000 RPM, when the piston is moving down so quickly, there's going to be a bit of vacuum in this place over here where it's still sucking in air from the intake manifold, and that vacuum actually still continues up until the piston is heading back up. So by leaving the intake valve open for slightly longer, there's still air that is being sucked in when the piston is actually moving back up. So again, by tuning the valve timing to a certain point, you can actually optimize the volumetric efficiency of the engine to run best at a certain RPM. And usually in production car engines, that peak volumetric efficiency that they tune the cams and everything for, that's usually around like 4000 RPM, the mid RPM range basically. But in racing engines, it's quite the opposite thing. They usually want to maximize their volumetric efficiency at a much higher RPM. Because on the track, that's the range that the engine is always going to be running at. It's never going to go to that low RPM range, which is important for production cars, but it's not important for race cars. So now actually getting back to how to fill in your VE table and how to, just fill in all the proper values. This might actually be easier than what you think it is, because in these newer ECUs, there's O2 sensors and there's a bit of learning going on. So the engine is actually taking the value from the O2 sensors and it's actually correcting it, and it's actually giving you a new VE value over here. So basically, actually one map that you need to set up before you actually go on the dyno and run is your lambda target map. So basically, just to tell you what this map is, this is all your air-fuel ratios. Again, this is the RPM and this is the engine map. And basically, you're telling the ECU what air-fuel ratios you want it to meet at a certain load level and at a certain RPM. Once you have all this lambda target table set up, what your ECU is going to do is that it's actually going to take the readings from the O2 sensors and it's going to keep changing the VE on its own, trying to meet that target lambda value. So what you're going to see over here is that you're going to have a certain VE percentage over here. That's the VE that you set on this table. And then there's going to be a new VE value over here that is going to be the actual VE that the ECU is using to meet that lambda target that you have set in the lambda table. So to fill in the VE map, all you literally need to do is you need to do a few runs on the dyno so that the ECU can learn, because the problem with the learning is that it takes a while. The first dyno run you'll do will not be perfect, but when you'll do 2 or 3 runs on the dyno, then it will keep learning, and then it will keep getting these lambda values closer and closer to your target lambda that you have set on this table over here. And eventually you'll find out that these lambdas will start looking good, like they will be right on. And then once your lambdas are looking good, all you need to do is you need to go back to those values, see what the new VE value was when the engine was at that load level and at that RPM, and then you simply need to take that new VE value and put that into this one. So then the next time you will start your engine, it will not need to go through the whole learning process and everything again. You will just do the first run on the dyno, and following these values, it should give you the perfect air-fuel ratios to begin with. Now, another really interesting thing about the VE table is that it will also tell you what your torque curve should look like, somewhat. because obviously the more air you're sending into the engine, the more fuel you're sending into the engine as well, because it will have to follow to meet a certain air-fuel ratio, and that means the more torque you get at that RPM. So basically, if you have an engine that is breathing extremely well at, let's say 4,000 RPM, but it does not breathe too well at 7,000 RPM or at low RPM, your torque curve should look something like this. Like it should go up at those RPMs, and then it should start falling back down at a higher RPM when there's not too much air going in the engine. So basically, once you have your VE table set up, that will already give you a really good idea of how your engine is breathing and how your engine should perform on the dyno. Just to give you a better visual representation of how this is actually going on, this is the 3D thing that you see over here. It's basically the same. This 3D thing is basically just the same representation of all these results, but so this axis over here is this axis. This is the map. This is the engine speed, RPM, and this value, the z-axis this time, is actually the values that I have filled in. So let's say if it's at 110, that load cell will go at 110. By the way, my values are a little higher than what you would usually expect. This is probably just because of a miscalculation somewhere, like either the injector size is not as big or as small as I've put in, or maybe the fuel pressure is slightly off. Usually you would see values that should be around 90% or something, but you shouldn't see values like 125 and stuff. But anyways, a really interesting thing I wanted to show you about my engine is that when my engine is not running any boost level, so this is actually the load level. I have everything programmed till this. All this is, by the way, just ignore this part. I haven't actually programmed this part. This is like running all the way to 22 psi, but I've only tuned everything up to 9 psi. So this is just like I've copy pasted all these values up till here. But this one is pretty accurate. Like everything over here till here is the values that I actually saw on the dyno, and I filled in according to the VE values that were in. So basically, a really interesting thing you'll see about this engine, the way it's breathing, is that when it's when the turbos are not on, and when it's at these low load levels of the map where the turbos are not doing anything at all, you'll see that the engine is actually peaking up, like it's reaching its peak volumetric efficiency about 4,500 RPM. That's generally, or 4,200 RPM. That's, you can say, where the peak volumetric efficiency is reached at. It's more like a production car engine basically, and then as the RPM goes up, it starts falling down again. But when the turbos kick in, it's actually the complete opposite thing. It becomes more like a racing engine. Now the volumetric efficiency is reaching its max, like at a really high RPM over here. It is going to come down when the boost level goes up, because this actually has to do something with the way the turbos are sized. I'm not going to talk too much about turbo sizing or supercharger sizing in this video, but it's actually an extremely important thing to do, to match the turbo size with your engine, because if the turbos are too big, then you might not even be reaching this peak volumetric efficiency even at max RPM. It might be like somewhere at this point over here. And if the turbos are too small, your peak volumetric efficiency would be somewhere over here, and then the flow would start to die off as the RPM goes up. But the way I have my turbo sized is that I'm reaching peak volumetric efficiency somewhere around max RPM right now. But once I take the boost higher, this should come down. This should come down to somewhere over here. Because turbos have an efficiency too, by the way. Just like the engine has this efficiency curve, turbos will also reach their peak efficiency at a certain speed when they're spinning at a certain speed, or a certain flow, I should say. So when I take the boost higher to 15 psi, then all of a sudden the turbos are flowing more. So that's why they're going to reach their peak efficiency at an earlier stage compared to the engine speed. And the same with the supercharger, actually. When you put a smaller supercharger pulley on a supercharger, then you're actually taking that peak efficiency of the supercharger to a lower engine speed. So you'll basically improve the flow at a lower RPM, but you might not make too much of a difference in the higher RPMs. So the way my turbos are sized, once I step up the boost level, once I go to like 15 psi, hopefully my peak volumetric efficiency should come down to about 5,500 RPM. And that's exactly what I wanted to keep it at, because what that's going to do is that the usable rev range on the track is usually from 4,500 RPM to 6,500 RPM for this engine. So once I bring the peak volumetric efficiency down to this range, then that would mean that my torque curve would pretty much be flat all the way from 4,500 RPM to 6,500 RPM, and that's the best way to make the most, because it's pretty much running at its peak potential all through the rev range. So now that I've talked quite a bit about the VE table, next what I need to talk about is the ignition map. The ignition map actually tells the ECU when to fire the spark plug. So actually, let me just go back to the animation again to show you guys something. So going back to this engine animation, there's one more thing I wanted to show you guys, that when the compression stroke happens, and right after the compression stroke it's the power stroke, when the spark plug fires and this ignites the air-fuel mixture and then this pushes the piston downwards. So basically the thing you'll notice about when the spark plug fires is that the spark plug fires before the crank even reaches top dead center. So you might think, isn't that like, why would you fire the spark plug at this point when it's pushing the piston back downwards and it's trying to spin the engine the opposite way? But the reason for that is that when you think of the engine spinning at a really fast RPM, you need to ignite this air-fuel mixture really quickly, because let's just say the engine is spinning at 7,000 RPM, the duration of the entire power stroke would be like 3 milliseconds or something. So to burn the air-fuel mixture so quickly, you will actually need to build up quite a lot of pressure inside the combustion chamber. To make better sense of that, I'll just use this graph over here. So if you plot a graph of crank position versus cylinder pressure, so this is the pressure inside your cylinder, and this is as the crank position is changing from -180 when the piston is all the way down before the compression stroke, and then this is the compression stroke when the piston is slowly moving to top dead center, and then this is the power stroke when the piston moves back down again. So the blue line would be if there is no power, if the spark plug doesn't fire at all. So if the spark plug doesn't fire, it will just build a whole bunch of pressure inside the combustion chamber, and then it will just go back down. It will release all that pressure. There will be no net gain or loss in energy. Whatever energy went into compressing all this air would be gained back when the air uncompresses. But in reality, there is going to be a bit of loss because there's air escaping through the piston rings, obviously, so you don't really get as much air back as you're compressing. But anyways, yeah, that's not the point. The point here is that this is what the air will look like once you fire the spark plug. So let's say the spark plug fires somewhere over here. Then when the air-fuel mixture ignites, it causes this whole bunch of extra pressure on this end. And then this extra pressure, this basically difference in this pressure is what gives your engine power. This is what will give your engine the torque output it's giving you. And this tiny part over here is the part where you're actually pushing the piston down backwards. And this is actually something that makes the engine inefficient, and it's actually making you lose power. So looking at this example, you might say that why not fire the spark plug at 0 degrees, so you're only pushing the piston in the right direction and this thing isn't even happening. Like, what's the point of this if you're pushing the piston backwards? But if you fire the piston at this point, what's going to happen is that, well, what happens, the reason why you advance the ignition is that you're trying to raise the cylinder pressure up higher, because the whole point of compression and the whole point of raising cylinder pressure is to make the combustion more spontaneous. You're raising cylinder pressure inside the engine so that everything is at a higher pressure, at a higher temperature, so that the air-fuel mixture burns quicker. So even by changing this ignition timing slightly over here, what you're doing is that you're actually igniting the air-fuel mixture when the piston is still coming upwards, when it's still compressing the air. And that combination of combustion and compression happening at the same time causes this air-fuel mixture to burn extremely quickly, and that's why it gives you such a high amount of pressure over here that then pushes the piston down really quickly. So if you simply fire the spark plug 20 degrees later, what happens is that now the piston has already compressed the air all the way, and the piston is uncompressing the air as the air-fuel mixture is igniting. So the combustion, therefore, is not just slightly slower; it's quite a lot slower, and therefore you don't get such high pressures over here. You get much lower pressures, and the graph actually looks something like this. Like it's a much lower pressure, therefore it takes a lot longer for the air-fuel mixture to ignite, and then there's a lot of wastage over here. This is the point where the exhaust valve opens, by the way. So most of that pressure, most of that air-fuel mixture is then igniting when the exhaust valve is open. So you're actually throwing all that burning air-fuel mixture out of the exhaust. It causes for some spectacular flames coming out of the exhaust, but it doesn't really give you any extra power. So that's why for ignition timing, for every certain load and for every certain RPM, there is going to be a certain point where you will fire the spark plug, where you will get the most amount of torque out of the engine. And that's going to be the most efficient point to fire the spark plug, and it's going to be, well, what's going to give you the most power. If you fire it too early, then the wastage over here will be too much, and the gain you will get from that will not be enough. If you're firing it too late, then obviously the wastage, you're throwing all the air-fuel mixture out of the exhaust, will be more than whatever you're gaining by not wasting the energy over here. So getting back to how to actually set up your ignition map now. So actually, by the way, for my ignition map, just ignore all these values. These values are for stuff that I have not even gotten to right now, because I only ran the engine up to 9 psi. So basically all this range is the range that is that I'm actually not even 7,000, 6,500. This is the range that I'm using right now. All this is the range that I might be using later, but I haven't set anything in this range right now. But all this range is pretty much set and good to go. But talking about how to set these values so that all these values are set to the most efficient point, the way most purists would like to do it, and the proper way to do it is to actually set the dyno to stop the engine at a certain RPM. So let's say 4,000 RPM, you would stop the engine at that RPM. You would take it to a certain load level, let's say 2 psi. You would stop it at that load level, then you would ramp this value up from, let's say, 0 degrees to you would keep ramping it up by 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, and then when you look at the torque output would keep going higher, 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 and then at a certain point it would start falling down again. That point where it reaches its peak is the point that you should have in this load cell, and that's how you'll know that this load cell is set properly. Now the problem with that method is that, well, if you have a lot of time on your hands, that's definitely a really good way to do it, because that way you'll get the most accurate results. But realistically, it's something that if you have your own dyno and your own shop and everything, that's the only point where it's going to be feasible to do it. But if you're renting a dyno for 2 hours, it's not going to be enough time to go through every cell and set everything properly, because you're just not going to have that much time. So the way I like to do it is that I like to start off with, like, let's say all 14s, and I run the car on that, see how the car does, and then what I like to do is that I start off with one cell at a time and I start incrementing it. So let's say everything is set to 14, and then for this cell I'll go to, let's say, 15. I'll see how the torque output does. What you see on the torque output then is that let's say the torque is going like this. Either at this value, when the engine gets to this RPM, either the torque is going to go up or the torque is going to go down. If the torque is going down, that definitely means that you're going in the wrong direction. You should be going back down. But if the torque keeps climbing up, that means that you're still going in the right direction. Then I'll still keep incrementing it until I get to a certain point where the torque starts saturating, where it's not going up anymore. And actually, well, the other thing that I look at while doing that, and the extremely important thing to look at, is the knock values. So the knock is the other thing to keep in mind whenever you're setting ignition timing, because what happens is, for all these lower load values on this thing, these values are not going to be knock limited. So no matter how high you go on these, your torque will start falling, but you wouldn't really detect any knock. But for all these higher load values, when there's quite a lot of pressure in your cylinder already, what's going to happen is that when you give it too much timing, your engine is going to start knocking. Well, just to quickly explain what knock is when you fire this spark plug so early that all this air fuel mixture starts igniting, and it creates such a high amount of pressure in your combustion chamber that it's higher than the flash point of your fuel. So basically what happens is that all the air fuel mixture ignites even faster than it's supposed to be igniting. So rather than all this air fuel mixture igniting when the piston have moved back down and there's a bit more space in the combustion chamber to, like, fill all the combustion chamber with so much air and fuel burning, the piston is at such a high point and all the air fuel mixture already burns all the way. So what that causes, it causes an extreme spike on that graph, and what that spike does is it takes the cylinder pressures up so high that it starts causing damage inside the engine. Like, it will start melting pistons, or it will start bending connecting rods, and yeah, basically it's something you want to stay away from. So the way you can prevent knock is, well, manufacturers actually, when they're developing prototype engines, they actually do put probes inside the engine so that they can actually see what type of cylinder pressures are going on inside the engine. But for most of us, that's definitely not going to be an option. So what we should be doing is that we should be looking at the knock values. These are actually the raw values coming from the knock sensors on every cylinder. So, well, there's only 2 knock sensors, but like, it's listening to those knock sensors right after let's say cylinder 1 is firing, and that's how it's getting this value. So what you can do is, if you're only changing the ignition timing on 1 RPM at a certain time, what you can do is you keep looking at these values, and if you see a spike in the knock values at that RPM, then you definitely know that there's something going on, there's knock going on. And once you reach that point, once you see what type of spike you see over here, you can actually set that value on this knock noise floor over here. So at that RPM, you'll just go and you'll set this so that the ECU knows that what type of value knock is going to happen at, and then the next time that happens, the ECU is automatically going to detect knock, and it's going to retard the ignition timing automatically if that happens again. But for me, unfortunately, what happened was that I never even reached the knock limit of my engine, because well, I guess now it's a good time to actually go through all the dyno results and show you guys what actually happened on the dyno after like a good 30 minutes into the video. But yeah, anyways, going over what happened at the dyno. So the first few runs we did, we were just doing low RPM runs. Like I think we were revving the engine all the way to 5,000 RPM, and that was it. Just to get everything figured with the low RPMs first before moving on to the higher RPMs. But the only thing that I think I shouldn't have done is that, well, I started off with the base map that was in the AEM Infinity, and whereas I think I should have just started from scratch and made my own map, because the problem is that that base map was so far off from the way the engine was actually breathing that it took longer fixing all that. So initially the fuel terms were so far off that we had to do like 3-4 runs on the dyno just to get the air fuel mixtures to the right point, and then the engine would run properly. And obviously at the dyno I didn't have that much time to fix the full VE table, so I was just like changing random values at a time just to get it somewhere close. But obviously I didn't have enough time to set every load cell individually because 2 hours are way too little to get through all of that. But anyways, once the air fuel races were fairly figured and the engine was running consistently, next it was time to move on to the ignition timing and start setting that. The problem I ran into that I did not expect was that the engine was making quite a lot more torque than I expected. Now, you might remember from earlier videos that I mentioned that the clutch that I'm on right now, I just put this clutch on just so that I could get everything tested. It's not the final clutch. It was a much cheaper clutch just so that if something fails I don't lose too much money on wasting a brand new, really expensive clutch. But this clutch is only rated for 490 foot-pounds of torque, but I thought it would be good enough for 9 psi because stock E55s, well, they run 9 psi. That's the stock boost on an E55. And most of them actually only make like 420 wheel torques. But not on this engine. Even at 9 psi, once I started turning up the ignition table, the engine started making so much torque. We were seeing torque values as high as 480 foot-pounds of torque at the wheels. That's at the wheels, so that at the crank, that would already be way higher than the torque rating of the clutch. So at that point I was like, there's no way I can go any higher than this. Like, the clutch is definitely gonna fail if I keep going higher. So that's why we could not even reach the knock limit of the engine. I just had to limit the ignition timing wherever that like limit of the clutch was. So I decided to stay at like 470, 480, that level, and just try to level out the torque curve over there, so that I don't go too much higher than that and damage the clutch, obviously. Once everything with the low RPMs was figured, it was time to basically go slightly higher and then set everything up with the higher RPMs. So we did a few runs at 6,000 RPM just to see how the engine was running at that, and everything seemed fine. So then the next point was to move to 6,500, which is the red line on this engine, and then set the ignition timing properly over there. But unfortunately I never got to that part because we ran out of time on the dyno, so I never got to doing multiple runs on 6,500 RPM, but I only did one run at 6,500. That was the last run of the day, and it wasn't a really good run. The air fuel mixtures were really far off because obviously that was the first time the engine was running to that high RPM, so it hadn't learned anything like from that RPM, so it was running really lean. And the ignition timing after 5,500 RPM was not set properly. It was just, I should have been adding like 2 more degrees of ignition as the engine was revving upwards. But anyways, this was the result from that last dyno run, and the car made a ridiculous 520 wheel horsepower, even like running those air fuel ratios that were completely off and the ignition timing that wasn't even set. So realistically, like with the ignition timing set properly, this torque curve should be going flat all the way till red line, because obviously the limiting factor is the clutch. It's not the flow or anything in the engine. The engine can still produce even more torque. So yeah, realistically I should have been taking this torque straight up all the way to like 475 over here, whereas right now it's dropping all the way down to 425. But since this last dyno run I have made the correction. I have given it an extra 2 degrees of ignition timing, which I believe will make the final amount of difference, because well, this is a comparison of one older run and one newer run that we did now, and on this run this ignition timing over here was set 2 degrees less than what it was over here. So at 5,000 RPM I gave it another 2 degrees, and just look at the amount of difference just 2 degrees of ignition timing makes on this engine. So it moved a good like 50 wheel torques higher just because of giving it 2 more degrees of ignition timing, and this is still not anywhere close to the knock limit because we're still not seeing any knock on in any range in the RPM right now. So yeah, since then, making this correction, giving another 2 degrees over here, I believe that would make the difference between like taking this torque curve flat from all the way till this point, all the way till here. So basically the torque curve on this engine is flat all the way from 4,000 RPM pretty much all the way till red line. It's just a straight flat torque curve, and yeah, the horsepower level keeps going up. Right now the horsepower is at 520 because obviously it's at a much lower torque, but I believe the final number would be 550 or even higher than 550, to be honest. I won't get to do another dyno run on that because it doesn't make sense just to go back to the dyno just to do one more run just to see the final result. Everything is already set up and I know it's fine, so that's why, yeah, I'm just not going to do another dyno run. I'm going to leave that for when I actually upgrade the clutch and go for the final tune now, when I actually up the boost on the engine. but these are actually ridiculous numbers to see from this engine. I've actually never seen an M113K that is flowing this way, that makes so much torque at such high RPM and everything. Usually M113K engines, you see the dyno sheets from them, they make a ton of torque down low, like 4000 RPM, and then it completely dies off. There's like literally no torque at the high RPMs. It's completely dead. But with this engine, it's like completely turned over. These are results that you expect from a racing engine or something. It's making so much torque, and all the torque is literally at the usable rev range of the engine. That's exactly what it should be like on a race car. So I don't know about you guys, but I'm extremely happy with the numbers from this engine. These are extremely high numbers. Like, I was expecting good numbers, but I was not expecting numbers this high. This is incredible numbers. Like, this much power at just 9 psi of boost. 9 psi of boost is literally what this engine comes from the factory, what a stock E55 comes from, and this is giving like a full 150 more wheel horsepower on the same boost level. So once I step up the boost level, yeah, this engine is, yeah, my goal was 700 horsepower to get it up to 700 wheel horsepower, but I think I'm probably going to be able to cross that pretty easily. Realistically, yeah, I think it should be making like 750, maybe even 800 if I'm lucky at the wheels. On stock internals, and that's never been done before. I think usually people just hit 550 and that's the limit. If you haven't seen all the videos about when I rebuilt this engine and how I built it, yeah, you can definitely go back and see all those videos. There were definitely a thing or two done right with the engine. But anyways, talking about what's the plan for the next few weeks now, well, there's a bit of good news and there's a bit of bad news. Well, starting off with the bad news, actually. The bad news is that I missed my last track day. I was planning to take this car to the track, but I had it loaded on the trailer and everything was ready to go, and right after that it started raining, and it did not stop raining for the next 3 days. And after 3 days the weather got so cold it became like -4, -6 degrees, and right after that it started snowing. And yeah, it's literally early November and it's snowing in Canada. I did not expect the weather to get this bad this quickly, so that completely ruined the chances of any track day that I had left. But yeah, that's the bad news. The good news is that I did have a trip planned for California, that I wanted to take the car out hopefully after the first track day and then take it over there and drive it on a few tracks over there. Well, my plan was to actually get it there for Global Time Attack and then be part of that time attack, and well, actually I am still booked in that time attack, but I'm on the wait list. I booked a little late, so if there's any cancellations, then this car will actually be going to Global Time Attack like this weekend pretty much. And well, but I'm not going to be pushing it. Even if I get in for that time attack, it's not going to be like I'm going to go there the first lap, start driving at the full pace of the car, because there's quite a lot to figure out right now. Like, I have to set up the suspension, figure out the tire temperatures, dial in all the suspension angles, and I still have to figure out how the engine and everything is doing temperature wise, because I still haven't driven this car on the track, so I don't know how the temperatures are going to do. I don't know if there's going to be any problems, so all that is still left to figure out. So you guys might be asking, isn't that a really stupid idea, taking a car all the way to California that hasn't even been track tested? But to be honest with you, there's nothing I can do over here to figure all that out, because the weather is so cold. Like, thrashing this car around parking lots in these cold temperatures, I'm not figuring out anything. The tires are cold, the car is slipping all over the place, so these are not realistic conditions to test this car out. I'm not learning anything from it, and plus the weather is not going to be getting better over here, like in the next 6 months at least, so might as well just take the car down to California, get it tested over there. Even if it breaks down after one lap, at least I'll learn something that I won't get to learn over here up until like the next 6 months at least, so it's still definitely going to be worth it. By the way, big thanks to Mantis Racing for the dyno and everything. They were a big help. Like the guy over there who was helping me tune the car, Bryson, he's a really smart guy himself. He was setting up the dyno and doing all the runs, and that made my life a lot easier, because I could fully focus on the laptop, seeing what was going on with the ECU and everything. So yeah, if any of you guys want to get your cars tuned, those are definitely the right guys to go. They know their stuff, and they've been racing themselves. They have a few Porsches, and Bryson himself is actually, like, he races himself too. He has a Porsche 944, and actually he used to compete in the CSCS too, funny enough, back when I used to have my E55 and used to compete in the CSCS. So yeah, definitely the right people to go for if you're interested in booking a dyno and everything. And well, they pretty much have the best equipment and everything. Dyno Pack, those are the most accurate dynos that you can get. So I'll link their website in the description below. You can definitely go check them out if you're interested in tuning or any other performance stuff that you might need to get done on your car. Actually, I should also mention I had to put Patreon names on the side of the body panel over there. There's actually quite a bit of Patreon people that have joined in, and I've been really lazy. I still haven't gotten to putting all the names down, but these names, yeah, for sure, in the next video I'll have them down here. I've just been really busy with all this body work, making all these carbon fiber body panels, putting them on. But right after I put these on, yeah, I'm gonna put all the names down, put the full Patreon name list over here, and then yeah, after that, literally 3 days from now, I have to load this car on a trailer and then head down to California. But yeah, extremely excited about what's going to be coming in the next few weeks. This is going to be everything for this video. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.